Hi, everybody. Welcome. I'm Peggy Grease-Wager, the Interim Executive Director, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Joseph Slifka Center for Jewish Life at Yale. We are fortunate that our guest, Mikhail Fridman, chose to speak at the Slifka Center today during his visit to Yale and to share his Jewish journey with us. Also joining us today is Slifka's board president, David Slifka. If you could give us a wave. I would like to thank David for his tireless dedication to Slifka Center. We are also delighted to have with us Eric Fingerhut, president of Hillel International. I would also like to thank Eric and Hillel International for their generous support, which allows Jewish life to flourish at Yale. Now, our plan was to have a student introduce Eric, since we are a student-driven organization. But he had to cancel at the last minute. The good news is that I have known Eric for almost 30 years, so I guess I can jump in and take care of this job. Eric and I, little known fact, actually met on the singles mission to Israel in 1991. We were both from Cleveland, and that's all I'll say about that trip. But what I can say is that Jewish life has been important to Eric for as long as I have known him. He graduated from Northwestern and Stanford Law School, but his passion was public service. Eric served in the Ohio State Senate, was a U.S. congressman from Ohio, and was the top education chief for Ohio as the chancellor of the Ohio Board of Regents. For a professional who has devoted his entire life to public service and education, with a generous heart and a quick mind, there couldn't have been a better job than running Hillel International as its president and CEO. We are fortunate to have Eric at our helm. Eric will make a few comments and then welcome Michael. Then Michael will deliver remarks, followed by a Q&A. So please help me welcome Eric.
So they didn't tell me about the few remarks. I'm happy to welcome Michael. But before I do that, I do want to also thank Peggy Grease-Wager, the interim director of the Slifka Center for Jewish Life, and affirm that everything she told you is true. We have known each other for 30 years, but also add that you are so fortunate to have Peggy's energy and passion and really sense of love for the community, which I can already feel radiating out of this building. So Peggy, thank you for stepping up and helping lead us this year here at the Slifka Center. And of course, David, thank you for your leadership of the board, and please thank all of the leaders who make this program possible. And of course, I want to say thank you to the students who are here for your leadership, because, as Peggy correctly said, this is your community, and our job is to make it possible for you to build the kind of community here at Yale that you'd like it to be, and to begin the journey of building Jewish communities. So we not only thank you for your leadership of this Jewish community, but we tell you that we hope and pray that you will be leaders of Jewish communities for the rest of your life as you proceed through your professional and personal journeys that you'll be facing. Hillel is truly an international organization, which is why I don't have to comment separately about Michael, because operating in 17 countries, on 4 continents, in over 600 different locations, Hillel is truly the central address of Jewish life for college students and for young adults around the world. And that's really what has brought us so close to you, Michael, and to your philanthropy and your passions over the years. So I'm going to do 2 things here. One is give you his official biography, because I know that is important for us to understand, not only in this room, but also for those who are watching us. But then also make sure we understand the real impact that I have seen Mikhail Fridman and his work make on the world. So Michael Fridman is an international businessman, investor, and philanthropist who is a co-founder and member of the board of directors of the Genesis Philanthropy Group, which is how I've come to know him. Michael was born into a Jewish family in Ukraine. He graduated from school in 1980, where he won the school Olympiads in physics and mathematics. After graduating from one of the top universities in Moscow, he started a career as an entrepreneur. Together with several partners, he's built private businesses from the bottom up in retail banking, in telecommunications, insurance, and water. Michael is a co-founder of LetterOne, an international investment business, headquartered in Luxembourg, with offices in London and New York. LetterOne has around $23 billion under management and buys and builds investments internationally in the energy, telecoms, and technology, health, and retail sectors. LetterOne also invests in private equity funds and most recently bought the UK retail chain Holland & Barrett from the Nature's Bounty and the Carlyle Group for almost 2 billion euros. Holland & Barrett is one of Europe's largest health and wellness retail chains with stores in more than 1,150 locations worldwide. He's also co-founder of the ABHH Group based in Luxembourg, which invests in banking groups, which provide retail banking services in Europe and the former CIS. Michael is a member of the International Advisory Board of the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations, the founder of the International Jazz Festival in Lvov, which is now one of Europe's top 10 jazz festivals. He's an active supporter of Jewish causes around the world. He co-founded the Genesis Prize, which is awarded annually in Jerusalem, and I recommend that you all go. It's an unbelievable experience and has been dubbed the Jewish Nobel by Time magazine. He's also co-founder of the Russian Jewish Congress, which is an affiliate of the World Jewish Congress. That's Michael's extraordinary accomplishments. How I know him is that he has understood that Hillel, through its reach across the world, plays an important role, indeed a central role, in helping each generation of Jews find their own voice and their own journey into Jewish leadership and into Jewish communal life. And as a result, what began as a singular partnership, first in Russia and then expanded throughout the rest of the former Soviet Union republics, has now blossomed into a global strategic partnership between Hillel International and the Genesis Philanthropy Group to support and help us connect to Russian-speaking students and families and their friends on campuses all around the world, so as to help us build a single Jewish people for the future and for the next generations. And I will say that given his business accomplishments, Michael, we've learned a lot from you. The work in Hillel Russia has formed a model of how we measure and how we are assured of quality in our work all across the global movement. So we thank you for the leadership that has come from the Hillels that the Genesis Philanthropy Group supports and has become now part of the daily work of Hillels around the world. We all know that in the Jewish tradition, we have taken our Torah, we have taken the Old Testament, and we have divided it into weekly readings that we call parshiot, weekly sections of the Torah reading. And it's particularly appropriate that we're having this meeting today and that we're going to get to hear from you, Michael, this week, because it's really the story of the birth of the Jewish people. This week is Lech Lecha, which famously begins with God speaking to Abram and telling him to leave his home and the land of his fathers and his father's house and go to the land that God will show you. It's a proof that all Jews come from the same origin. We all come from the same beginning. And there's a promise made in Lech Lecha at the very end when God says, "V'hakimoti et briti beini uveinecha uvein zarecha acharecha ledorotam." God promises to establish a covenant between God and between Abraham and his children and all generations after him for all time as an everlasting covenant. What I want to say particularly, Michael, is that we know that there have been moments in history when forces of the world have tried to break that covenant. And one such time, of course, was during the time of the Soviet Union, when the forces that be decided that somehow they could break that historic promise, that generation-to-generation promise that God began with Abraham in this week's Torah reading and promised to continue forever. But when the Soviet Union fell, it took a very special kind of leadership to begin to step in immediately and restore that covenant. And as we know, God has always taught us that while God can help create the world and make the promises, it takes human beings to help finish that work. What you have done personally and what your philanthropy has done through the Genesis Philanthropy Group and Genesis Prize is to restore that covenant for all those for whom the access to it had been barred, and now to help build the relationships all across the world between Russian-speaking Jews and the global Jewish people is really something that I believe history will look down upon, and I think Abraham would look down upon and say thank you for helping us restore that connection. So it's with great pleasure that I introduce to the Slifka Center, Mikhail Fridman.
Thank you. Thanks. So pleasant word about me. Thank you so much, and a great honor and pleasure for me to be here. And actually, we just started to talk with Eric and President Salovey and other distinguished member of Slifka Center that just how many Jews actually right now students of Yale, and it's very kind of interesting answer. That's probably it's around like 12.5% officially according survey, which kind of attribute students according to their religious identity, and 12.5 was attributed as a Jews, as a, kind of a believer in Judaism. Means that probably much more people who are Jews by their origin are not effectively admitted themselves as a Jewish people. And that's interesting and symptomatic issue, it seems to me, for the modern world. As Eric mentioned, I grew up in the Soviet Union. I was born in a western Ukrainian city called Lvov. It's very historically tightly connected with the Jewish history city, one of the most Jewish probably city in the world. Before the Second World War in 1939, more than 30%, almost 40% of population of Lvov were Jews. It was probably more than 200,000 inhabitants of the city. After Second World War, and probably there was dozens of synagogues there and so on. After the Second World War, less than 100, not 100,000, but 100 Jews survived in this city, and the whole, effectively, history of Jews was almost finished in the city. When after the war, certain kind of amount of Jews, including my parents, came there from the other territory of Russia and Soviet Union and Ukraine, and again, to a certain extent, the life of Jews in the city started again. It was a very different and difficult time. Effectively, religion as a whole, and particularly Judaism, Jewish religion, was more or less prohibited. There is no one synagogue in that time, despite probably 10% of population still has Jewish connection. And in my childhood, in my boyhood, I would say, there is no any symbol or sign of Jewish life for me personally and for my parents, who was absolutely secular Soviet people, an engineer, except maybe once per year my grandmother brought matzah from somebody who did it at home. It was impossible to buy it in a shop. That was also prohibited. So that was kind of handmade matzah, which is, by the way, was quite tasty, as far as I could recall it. So, and first time I went to synagogue, so I completely was out of any Jewish rituals. I didn't have bar mitzvah, I didn't have brit milah, or my kind of food was quite far from kosher, especially living in Ukraine, where is the most popular food is pork. You know, so from that point, I never been anyhow connected with the Jewish tradition. And I definitely haven't been in synagogue because, as I mentioned, there was no synagogue in the city in that time. On one hand. On the other hand, because our authority remind us who we are every single day, it was almost official prohibition for certain university, for certain job position, for certain type of career, for instance, political career or administrative career. It was clear that we could not get certain level of our kind of ambition because of that. And to a certain extent, this type of oppression and discrimination, keep alive Jewish community and Jewish identity, because we always remember who we are. For instance, for my parents, and it was prohibited, almost officially, to leave the country, and therefore my parents and neither way, no me, been abroad until I became kind of adult when the time has changed. Time has changed in the 80s. Since the appearance of Mr. Gorbachev as a president of Soviet Union, and the whole situation became vastly changed. First time I've been in synagogue when I went to Moscow, when I was 17. And by the way, it was also a bit risky because if somebody could see that you are visiting synagogue, you could easily would be fired from the university. So that was kind of type of military operation to be there, so nobody should see you there. And things like that. So that was my. So I always felt as a Jew because I knew that I have a lot of limitation in this life, but I didn't know at all what about Judaism. Fortunately, in the middle of 80s and end of 80s, situation has changed, political situation, and it became more liberal, more open society. Became, as you probably all of you knows, and then first time read kind of Old Testament, Torah, and what I was wondering, that actually, for me, that was not a religious kind of text, first of all, which is probably very different from people around. For me, it was primarily a kind of literature about the very typical Jewish character. And what's interesting, that the character which was described in Torah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Isaac, Moses, all of this character was very recognizable. It was very similar to friends of mine, family, relatives, brothers, so on. And I feel all were passionate, vibrant, characters, very typical for Jewish behavior. And for me, it was a kind of important point of changing my attitude toward Judaism. For me, Judaism is rather not a necessarily religious or ritual behavior. It's actually philosophical ground for living. And I consider myself as a believer, but not religious person, because for me it would be quite unusual, to follow suddenly a certain tradition which I never got before when I was a young kid, but to follow certain philosophical and ethical pattern, that probably would be very, very important and natural. So I actually believe that according to my experience, and that was probably one of the reasons why we started so actively be involved in Jewish philanthropy. One of the reasons that to follow all this kind of tradition of Jewish philosophy, all traditional Jewish values and principles, would be probably one of the most efficient way to be successful in your life, in all aspects of your life, not necessarily just in career, not necessarily in business, but even in your personal life. And I think that the principle of Jewish life, which forged within the thousands of years of Jewish history, actually one of the most efficient way have to get a success in all your endeavor. And I think that for the time being, we are facing new challenges. We are very fortunate to live in a period when actually all these limitations and discrimination steadily disappearing, especially in the, let's say, Western world, especially in a country like United States. And it's very good news for people who are living today. They feel as absolutely equal to anybody else. And it's a great success and a great luck for us that we're living in a period of tolerance and a period of severe fight with xenophobia in different form. But at the same time, talking about that, I think that it is very important to find a way how to preserve Jewish identity, because probably this old discrimination and oppression which our people came through, to a certain extent preserve Jewish community within the, generation, within the thousands of years of Jewish history. Right now, we are facing new challenge, which means assimilation, which means that modern society would like to embrace Jews and welcome them. And to a certain extent, it's a huge temptation for Jews to become just regular American, European, German, kind of British, and so on, which is okay. But at the same time, I think it is important for us to find a way how to retain Jewish identity, have to retain all this philosophy, historical heritage, knowledge, and principles, which was extremely fruitful and successful for thousands of genius Jews who contributed a lot for the modern world. I think that's a challenge, and that's a goal for us and for you guys who living now and who will succeed us as a next generation of Jewish leader. And that's why it is extremely important and pleasant for me to be here in Slifka Society, which is, from my point of view, one of the flagship of modern Jewish life. So thank you very much for the invitation.
Thank you. So, Michael,
Yeah.
I guess I'm Mike now.
Yeah.
If you'll have a seat here, then we will have a little Q&A discussion and involve the students.
Yes.
Okay? So I thought I would start off with the first question. So you mentioned a little bit about what sparked your Jewish journey once you were able to express yourself more openly in Russia, was visiting the synagogue. Could you tell us a little bit more about how your discovery of Judaism unfolded?
Actually, definitely living in my early ages, I lived in a Jewish environment. We did not know that it's called Jewish environment because effectively that was just a circle of my friends of my parents and relatives and and so on. And so what I understood in that time, the kind of the rules of behavior, kind of tradition, not necessarily religious tradition, because as I said, we almost lost all this religious tradition, but generally, in a day-to-day life, it's a bit different from people who living around, right? And it was not kind of offensive, let's say, to the external world, but it was always clear understanding that's a bit separate from the kind of people who live neighborhood, right? So, and it was never been kind of position like we respect all the other approach to that. We respect tradition of Ukrainian people or Russian people who lives near us, but at the same time we always try to keep certain bit different way of kind of day-to-day behavior and so on. For instance, the good example which I'm always making, that when first article about our business activity appeared in media, my mother called me and she was very disappointed. The normal mother probably would be very happy that, so that some articles about her son that, he's successful in some area, but my mother was really, kind of very sad. She said, why you could not ask them not to writing about you? It would be much better if no information. Within a certain period of time, for instance, she does not want to, because neighbors ask her, we've read about some guy, Fridman Mikhail, is it your Michael, who we know? She said, no, he's not one. She just tried to hide it. It's a small example how tradition is different, how the people treated differently, in a similar situation, right? So, and I understood in certain times that despite my parents is not completely religious at all, they didn't read Torah, we don't know about this, but inevitably, the whole this experience, knowledge of generation, was implemented in their day-to-day life, in their habits, in their tradition, kind of assessment of certain values and what is good, what is bad, how we should. For instance, my mother always told, look, you should understand clearly. You should be much better than whoever else many times to reach the same level of kind of success as anybody else, because you will always have a kind of huge, obstacle and barrier and problem. And I am sure that more or less in each Jewish family in Soviet Union and all across the globe, Jewish mothers saying more or less the same issues, right? So it's still repeating this issue. I think that was the understanding of this, understanding of of principle on which Jewish culture, Jewish philosophy rely. That was the main path for me, and I'm sure for many other people, to recognize their Jewish identity, in our particular part of the world, right? So because we didn't have, unfortunately, traditional way to know about Judaism, as many of you have here in the United States or somewhere else. So and that's why when I first time went to synagogue, that was just rather symbolic act to be attached to certain kind of ritual part of Jewish life. But growing, I understand better and better that all my values, all things which I inherited from my parents and from grandparents from before, was exactly based on all this philosophy and tradition and so on. And one of the feeling which I had in that time was that, in certain period of time, I started to think that I'm kind of link in a very long chain, which is started, hundreds of generations ago and still continue. And certain moment of my life, I decided that I will be not the last one. I would like that on my personal position, that the chain will continue, So that was probably, for me at least, my way to become a Jew,
Wow, that's beautiful. I want to open it up to students. Yes.
What challenges do you and Genesis assess Jewish communities in Ukraine and Russia face today?
That's exactly what I already started to talk. I think that, fortunately, for the time being, this official anti-Semitism is more or less over. We don't know for how long. We hope that it's forever. But right now, it's a good luck for all of us who are living today that this official oppression is, to a certain extent finished. That's a good news. Bad news that because of lack of connection with the Judaism, with the religion, there is no any serious denominator for people who are Jews by their blood with Jewishness. We don't know any languages. Effectively, Yiddish, disappeared. I mean, Germans during the Second World War killed 6 million Jews, and it was an idea of final decision of Jewish question. We didn't succeed in, but effectively we almost killed Eastern European Jews. I mean, no language anymore. All my grandmother and grandfather speak to each other only Yiddish. This language does not exist. A couple of Nobel Prize winners wrote their books in Yiddish. That language is dead. We don't speak Hebrew because we are not. we are not religious, so we are not going to synagogue. I mean, vast majority of Jews living in Russia and Ukraine today, because we've been cut from the tradition within almost 80 years. And generally, society become less religious, more secular. That's a kind of common problem for the whole world, right? For the United States as well. So, what effectively connected us with the Jewishness? I would say it's just a history, probably. Holocaust, one of the huge denominator for many of us. Israel, probably, but you know probably better than me that it's a lot of criticism towards Israeli policy and then the kind of human rights, things like that, which has become very sensitive. And very often I listen that, especially from American Jews, that I'm a proud Jew, but I do not want to have any sympathy to Israel because I don't agree with the policy of this country and things like this. So I think it's very limited amount of common denominator among the Ukrainian, Russian, and many other places, Jews with a Jewishness, except the specific names and certain memory about their past, about their predecessor, who sacrificed their life effectively to being Jews, right? And I think it is important, and I think that's a challenge for our generation to find some new method and new denominator, how to make people remember them who we are, what for their predecessor, their grandparents, paid so huge price, effectively. And probably it's your goal as well.
The woman in the Burberry? In the burgundy?
Hi. So you lived in both Lviv and Moscow during Soviet times. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about how the experience of being a Soviet Jew was or was not different in Lviv from the way it was in Moscow.
It's a good question. I would say, it was quite similar life. Actually, Soviet life was very egalitarian. That was a main kind of philosophical ground of Soviet socialism, to make egalitarian approach for everybody, for everything. I think that the distinction was that in Lvov, it was a bit more Jewishness generally in the city, because of tradition, because of more kind of tightly connected Jewish community. It was really relatively tiny city. It was like, so it was like 10% of population. It was a huge portion of population. It was much less than it was before the Second World War, but still it was pretty important. And to a certain extent, this tradition were alive in that time. And, local people, they remembered of Jewish presence in this city. They know it's always been a city of many different ethnical, let's say, tribe. It was a city of Polish people, Ukrainian, Jews, Russian, Serbian, Armenian, and so on. That was a, kind of part of Hansa. It was a trading city, and people understood, the difference between different, ethnics, between different religious groups, and they treated each other more professionally, let's say. They understand, they respected each other. We've been more accurate about it. Moscow, from that point, was very different. Moscow was capital of Russian Empire, historically. And that was Russian city, definitely. Jews didn't play an important role in this city. As you know, until 1917, the so-called line of Pale, Pale settlement, that was a kind of impossible legally to live in Moscow. So effectively, Jews appeared in Moscow after revolution, and they actually became tiny minority in this city. Very important minority because, as you know, in the first period of Soviet power, Jews played extremely important role there. But it was minority. And then, and also what is important that, again, of Jews who became Soviet leaders, Soviet kind of, made Soviet type of success, they tried hardly to forget about their Jewish roots. They always tried to be portrayed as a kind of Soviet people, because it was much more comfortable for making a career at that time. So I would say Moscow was not at all Jewish city. That was just kind of city with a certain amount of Jews living, with not trying to demonstrate their Jewishness. Lvov from that point was a bit different. So, but it still was very, very similar country with a similar type of politics, concept, slogans, salary, so everything was more or less, food in the shops, restaurant. Every restaurant have the same menu. For me, that was quite unusual that exists some different type of cuisine. So it's more or less the same with the different ethnical groups in Soviet Union.
Okay, let's see what's on the mind of more students.
First off, thank you for being here. In your remarks today, you've talked about the importance of Jewish identity, Jewish culture, Jewish philosophy, and its impact on Jewish success throughout history. So from your vantage point as someone who's achieved great success yourself, what are some of the key ideas from Jewish culture and thinking that have most contributed to Jewish flourishing and success?
Very good question. I think, again, I do not want to argue with a religious kind of concept. My guess that Judaism and Jewishness as a kind of phenomena is a phenomena of minority who would like to stay as a minority. It's for the normal human being, it's very natural to have a intention and desire to join the majority, because to be in a minority is always challenging, right? It's always uncomfortable. If you're analyzing history of Jews, and if you're analyzing history of mankind, there are hundreds of different nations, and for instance, in territory of, let's say, Russia, Soviet Union, just 500 years ago, lived dozens of different nations who we don't even remember names of this nation and tribes, right? So all of them effectively assimilated and disappeared and became more or less, unified majority of, let's call Russian, or the same, I think, in any place in Europe. In Germany, for instance, in the 17th century, there was dozens of different states in this territory with a different tradition and different tribal characteristic and so on. Right now, it's Germany, as a Germany. Why it's happened? Because effectively, if somebody won the war, effectively that he implement their own tradition and values and religion very often, and effectively people join this because they believe that it's more stronger, more efficient way of living. Jews, one of the unique nations which came through the thousands of years of history, survived as a Jews, living in the surrounded by all other tribes, nation, and culture, but still keep their own tradition, values, and religion. And I think it was a huge temptation for many of them to join the majority, right? And probably a sizable part of Jews historically, assimilated, and just very kind of tiny minority kept their own path, their own way of thinking, of doing something, of everything, and stubbornly would like to stay as a minority. I think that creates very important features of Jewish character. to be a minority, to be so stubborn, it always requests a lot of aspiration, and to be ready for challenge every single day. And I think that was transformed to this feature, were transformed to very typical Jewish approach to many kind of aspects of human activity. In the science, in arts, everywhere, Jews always on the cutting edge of changes. We're always trying to challenge, We never agree with a certain kind of proven wisdom. We always would like to undermine this kind of proven truth, right? So we're always trying to change perception about something. Look for any, and I think to a certain extent that's connected with the history and with the values which are typical for Jews. No authority for them, no moral authority, no legal authority. Just their own, kind of challenge and their own desire to achieve their own goal. I think that's very important characteristic which allow for many of Jews become so successful in many areas. And look, even now, the whole this high-tech industry. Look for Israel, that's amazing. Because that will require always not be agreed with a kind of traditional approach. And I think to a certain extent that's already very deeply implemented in the Jewish genes, I would say. That's why I think it's so important to retain. Because that could make a huge contribution to the life of the whole, mankind.
Wow, that's fascinating. Is there a student back there? That's you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Like you, I was born in Ukraine, in Odessa, and a lot of my family that came over here are very conservative and voted for Trump. One of the presidential candidates this year was Jewish, spoke against the conservative tradition. Jumping off of your point where you were talking about fighting against tradition, mostly conservative traditions of the past, where does Jewish philosophy advocate for us to go forward? Should we assimilate against a tradition, or should we bond with other minorities, a la Bernie Sanders?
I definitely do not believe that we should assimilate. I think it is great. I think we should find a way how, on one hand, to be part of modern society, to be part of non-xenophobic, tolerant, open-minded society. On the other hand, to retain our specific, our uniqueness to a certain extent, and to preserve our ability to make this world much better place rather than it was before. And I think, religion could play important role again as a kind of contribution of values. I don't necessarily believe that future of Jewishness just about religious people. I don't want. I could not imagine that the kind of future of Jewish community would be just only Haredim who actually would be Orthodox believer. I think we should find a kind of golden middle between being attached with the tradition, at the same time to be open-minded for modern, mostly secular society. I don't know a precise answer for this question. We're trying to find. Genesis Philanthropy Group, the main goal for this, is try to find what is the best method to keep this balance. And we're considering probably a connection with Israel should be a very important part of Jewish identity. We believe that culture, which is quite unique, and we could find some very kind of concrete example of uniqueness of Jewish culture, which is make a distinction between Jewish culture and culture of many other nations, could be kind of this element which will keep Jewishness alive, But we definitely don't know, very kind of final answer on that question. And I think, again, that's the challenge we are facing right now. And I think depending of how you guys will answer, we will respond to this challenge that will very heavily impact for the destiny of Jewishness.
Michael.
Thank you so much for being here. And first of all, I just want to say, hearing your story, and as someone who went to day school my whole life, it's just really inspiring and makes me realize how amazing of an opportunity that was. So last year I was the co-president of the student body at the Hillel, and oftentimes I would go around and talk to students, the 12.5%, but mostly I would try to talk to students who are the part that we don't reach of those 12.5% of students. And oftentimes they would say something like, I really want to learn more about Judaism and my Jewish identity, but I'm uncomfortable with the institutional Jewish community's approach to Zionism or Israeli policy, like you said. And as someone who cares a lot about assimilation and connection to Jewish identity, I was wondering if you think if changing the institutional Jewish community's approach to Zionism or the State of Israel could help strengthen Jewish identity or reduce assimilation, if you would think that that's a reasonable approach to solving some of these problems. And yeah, thank you so much for your time.
I think actually it's a lot of, in the history of Judaism, Jews demonstrated a huge flexibility regarding how we interpreted, Judaism and Jewishness, and have to fulfill religious, request and tradition, and from that point, it's to a certain extent, make me optimistic about future. I think that it is very important right now to find the right way, how to, on one hand, preserve tradition, on the other hand, to be kind of open-minded towards modern, sophisticated and fastly changing world. I think a couple of issues definitely will arise very quickly. I think the question of relation between Israel and diaspora become absolutely crucial point in the future. And I think for best success of Israel and best success of diaspora is crucially important to establish really close ties and bridge and connection. I think that what's happened sometimes, this disappointment in diaspora about Israel and vice versa, it's hugely dangerous for the future of both sides, hugely dangerous. I think we should undertake all our possible efforts to restore these close ties. I think that's really important. I think the voice of diaspora should be listened very carefully in Israel, and vice versa. Diaspora should better understand and be more actively involved in what's going on in Israel, to be advocating and promoting Israelis and Israel as a country outside the country, outside Israel. Right? I think it is also very important, to a certain extent, to change approach to a couple of, the most important issue, like, for instance, inter-religious marriage, right? So, according right now, it's a lot of debate in Israel and worldwide about giyur, effectively, and conversion in general. I think, that's very important to send the message on behalf of Jewish society that we are open. That not necessarily means we should change the tradition or destroy a kind of approach to that, which require very strict, kind of and serious efforts for becoming a Jew. But on the other hand, it seems to me, and again, I'm not a religious person, so I'm talking on behalf of myself. It is important to send message that our tent is open. So, as a tent of Abraham, you mentioned it. Mm-hmm. So we are welcome everybody who wish to become a Jew, who seriously consider this option, who wish to spend time and efforts to become a Jew. We open for them. We are not closed society. We are not would like to close our doors. So, and a couple of other issues. I think that's psychological change, which will hugely important for the future of Jews. And I think, again, historically Jews were quite flexible and adoptive. I rely a lot on these features. I do not want to even imagine that Judaism as a phenomena will somehow weakening.
Well, I think with this group in this room, we can count on it to remain strong. This has been a special and memorable event. I'm sorry we don't have any more time for questions because I'm mindful of Michael's schedule. I would like to just take a moment to thank Julie Goodman, our Director of Jewish Student Life, for putting this event together for us. Thank you, Julie. And I want to take this time to thank you, Michael.
Thank you.
For sharing
Thank
your
you for the
very
invitation.
valuable time with us and for enlightening us and for making a Yale education available for so many students.
Thanks.
With your generous support. We hope you will be a frequent guest to the Slifka Center.
I hope so.
I know you have to dash off to your next event, but I invite everybody else to stay for the reception outside. Thank you.